Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, church. I'm Mike Morrison, Associate Pastor here. Today we are starting a series on the book of Ruth. It's a short book in the Old Testament. Unlike some of the books in the Old Testament, it has a happy ending. We think you will enjoy the messages that this little book has for us. The book is set in the time of the Judges, sometime after Joshua led the Israelites into the land of Canaan, but before the Israelites had a king. This is when the Israelites were basically a confederation of tribes, maybe 1,050 years before Christ. We don't know who wrote the book or when. It might have been centuries later. The author, perhaps an editor, included a note in chapter 4 and verse 7. He mentions, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. No, I'm not going to have you do that. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the author, or the editor, was explaining this social custom that was no longer being used. He thought his readers might not understand what was going on. Social customs didn't change too quickly back then, so it seems that the book was written many, many years later after the events. The story would have been preserved as part of the oral tradition in the meantime. Some scholars think that the book was actually written in the time of Nehemiah as sort of a protest against Nehemiah's policy of forbidding marriage to non-Jewish women. The book is relevant to that social situation, but they said they couldn't invent the story out of thin air. In an era when genealogies were really important, the author couldn't simply make up a genealogy for the kings of Israel. And some people think the author might have been a woman. The book shows a lot more interest in women than most other books do. It seems to have more attention to life from the perspective of a woman. So that's possible, but we really don't know. But we do know for sure that the book is literarily very well written. It has good character development, good story flow, good use of descriptive language, good dialogues, and a good lesson for us. So over the next 4 weeks, we plan to cover this book of Ruth, one chapter a week. One chapter is a lot to cover in one sermon, but the good news is we don't have to say everything that could be said. We'll just read the story, draw out 1 or 2 lessons from each chapter. Maybe you'll think of some other lessons on your own. Let's start at chapter 1 and verse 1. It briefly sets the scene. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. That was the nation just east of Israel across the Jordan River. When the days when the judges ruled. The ancient Israelites might think of this Samson, Jephthah, Gideon. At a time when the Israelites had no centralized leadership, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, as the book of Judges says. These were not the good old days. These were the Wild West era of Israel, when there was a lot of social chaos. Their ideas of right were pretty twisted. There was a lot of idolatry, brutality, sexual sin. But in this sea of trouble, the book of Ruth is an island of virtue. People are generally doing what God wanted them to. There was peace in the land. But when people read the first verses of this story, they don't yet know that. When they hear that the setting is in the time of Judges, they might have pretty low expectations for what they were going to hear. But as the story progresses, they would be pleasantly surprised. At a time when most Israelites were setting bad examples, we have a story in which the main characters are good, and the foreigner is the hero of the story. Now, the story does start off on a bad note. There was a famine in the land. That's not totally unexpected. That's what we might expect for the time of the Judges, when people were breaking their covenant with God and he was not blessing them. The land of Judah is a dry land, and droughts and famines are occasional occurrences. So the story is set that his family decided to move somewhere else. Apparently the land of Moab was doing better than Judah was, so they moved to Moab, on the other side of the river. Some people might criticize them for leaving the promised land, but the narrator of the story doesn't seem to do that. They were just trying to survive. No reason that they would have to starve to death just because other people were poorly fed. In verse 2, the narrator gives a few more details. The man's name was Elimelek, and his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. So this is kind of restatement of verse 1. Elimelek means, my God is king. Naomi means pleasant. Mahlon means sickness. And Chilion means wasting. Now, people don't actually name their kids sickness and wasting. These names are really descriptions of their role in the story. Hebrew literature sometimes took liberties with people's names. For example, King Saul had a son named Eshbaal. This might refer to the Canaanite god Baal. Whoever wrote the book of Samuel decided that this was not a good name, so the guy was given a different name, Ishbosheth, which means man of shame. People don't name their own children man of shame. But later historians might put that in there. They thought Baal was a shame on the nation. So whenever a person had Baal in their name, they would replace it with shame. So in a similar way, the sons of Elimelek were given new names in accordance with their role in the story. They were sickness and wasting. Fortunately, we don't hear a lot about that. They were from the clan of the Ephrathites, living in the small town of Bethlehem, and they moved to Moab, hoping for greener pastures. Well, maybe they got that, but they also found some tragedy. In verses 3 to 5. Now, Elimelek, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. Israelite men were not supposed to marry Moabite women. That was a law created back in the days of Moses. So it seems that Mahlon and Chilion were not very obedient. There might have been a plague or something. After 10 years, they both died. Their exact manner of death isn't that important to the story. So in this economy of words, the author has set the scene. A problem has been described, and now the solution can unfold. If this were a play to be performed in a theater, it would be called a comedy, a story with a happy ending. But in order for there to be a story, there needs to be some tension, some problem to overcome. So here we have it, 3 widows, which in that society was not a very good situation to be in. Now, Orpah, you might think of Oprah, which is just a misspelling of Orpah. We don't know what the name means. Ruth means something like friend. That comes true in the story. So we've been brought quickly to this point, and then the story now slows down to give us a look at the personalities of these 3 women. Verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them in the land of Judah, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. They don't tell us anything bad about their life in Moab, but they preferred to be back in, or at least Naomi preferred to be back in Judah. The weather patterns had changed. Bethlehem was now getting enough rain and the crops were good. So Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem. Orpah and Ruth prepare to go with her. And that thought is repeated then in verse 7. With her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. But on the road, Naomi wonders if these young women really want to go with her. Maybe they're just going with her out of a sense of obligation. We'll soon find out that Naomi is pretty down on herself. She's pessimistic, depressed. She thinks no one would want to live with me unless they felt it was an obligation. So she tells them to go away. Verse 8, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home." Maybe their fathers had died. We don't know. If they felt obligated to stay with Naomi, if they felt that they needed to respect her, honor her, then this command would give them permission to go back home. They could show honor and respect to Naomi either way, either by staying with her or by obeying her command to go back to Moab. And then she gives them a blessing. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. And she kissed them goodbye. How did they respond? They wept aloud. Verse 10, and they said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." They apparently had a pretty good relationship with their mother-in-law. They wanted to stay with her, even if that meant they would immigrate to another nation and be foreigners in another land. "We will stay with you," they said. But Naomi tried to convince them, persuade them. Verse 11, she uses a little reason there. But Naomi says, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? I can't provide you with a husband." Of course, neither could their own mothers. So they probably had an equal chance of finding a husband in Judah as they did in Moab. But Naomi is kind of pointing out that she can't guarantee them anything. "Return home, my daughters," she says. "I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even in the best case scenario, even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to 2 sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them?" So here Naomi's actually kind of contradicting herself. She implies that they would not remain unmarried. They would indeed find husbands in the land of Judah. They'd be part of a different family, no matter whether it was they had gone to Judah or to Moab. But Naomi's kind of looking at things on the sour side. "No, my daughters," she says, "it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." And that's the problem. Naomi is having a pity party. "Woe is me. I must be living under some sort of curse. God is angry at me. Everything in life has turned out bad. Who would want to hang around with me?" Verse 14, the young women wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. Now, there's nothing wrong with what Orpah did. The story doesn't criticize what she did. In fact, the story could have gone quite well if she had never been mentioned in the first place. It seems that she's in the story because it was rooted in history, and there really was such a woman. So she goes back to Moab, and we don't hear anything more about her. From now on, the story is about Naomi and Ruth. And the last part of verse 14 says that Ruth clung to her. Ruth decided to stay with Naomi. We don't know exactly why, but she had a loyalty that went beyond the normal obligations of a daughter-in-law. Ruth was extraordinary, and that's what makes this a good story. Verse 15, "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods." Now we are starting to get a hint of religion here. Different nations had different gods. Israel had Yahweh, Moab had Molech, and other deities. Earlier, Naomi had given them a blessing in the name of the Lord. It seems that she had continued to worship the Lord even while she was in the land of Moab. She considered herself an Israelite, only temporarily living in Moab. The family was a little Yahweh island in the middle of this Molech sea. But if Orpah went back to Moab, she would go back to the gods of Moab. That helps prepare us for what Ruth will soon say. And so Naomi tells Ruth, go back with her. Go back to Moab. Go back to the gods of Moab. Maybe they'll be kind to you. You sure can't expect much out of my God because the Lord has turned his hand against me. Ruth doesn't try to reason with her. Naomi probably wasn't in a reasonable mood. Ruth doesn't explain that her odds of finding a husband are just as good in Judah as in Moab. She doesn't try to explain that the gods of Moab are no good. All she does is express her determination to stay with Naomi. Verse 16. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Ruth's words are sometimes read at weddings, but it's not a wedding here. It does have some similarity, though, because what Ruth is saying is similar to the words of a covenant. She's stating the relationship. The classic covenant formula is found in several places in the Bible, New Testament as well as Old. It's spoken by God. I will be their God, they will be my people. This is what I am to you, this is what you are to me. It's a statement of relationship. A marriage covenant was similar. I'll be to you a husband, and you'll be to me a wife. An adoption was similar. I will be to you a father, and you'll be to me a son. So Ruth is adapting that kind of language. She can't say how the people will view her, but she can say how she will view them. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I'm going to stay with you. Religion's part of the package. You might think that the Lord has turned his hand against you, but I'd rather have the Lord than those gods of Moab. I'm going to cross that river and not go back. Verse 17, where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. This is permanent. And then she takes an oath in the name of the true God. May the Lord deal with me ever so severely, even if death separates you and me. Even after you die, I'm going to stay in Judah. That's where I will live. That's where I will die. That's where I will be buried. Verse 18, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. Can you imagine that? Two women traveling on their own in this lawless time of the judges. There were no bridges across the river, no paved roads, no public rest stops, no hotels, no road signs, no road maps. It probably took them 3 days of constant walking through the desert. And they did not know what would happen when they got there. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi? We thought we would never see you again. Is this really you coming back to Bethlehem?" They gave her a great welcome, but she did not give a good reply. And in verse 20 she says, "Don't call me Naomi," that means pleasant. She said, "Call me Mara," that means bitter. "Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." My life is the pits. Woe is me. I went away full, she said in verse 21, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me pleasant? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune on me. It's God's fault. He's got something against me. He's taken away everything I ever had. All those years, and I have nothing to show for it. I'm empty, drained. Just call me bitter. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever felt that everything good in life had been taken away? That you were like an eggshell crushed under God's combat boots? Maybe the thought of God brings you bitterness. He didn't do what you thought he should. You felt picked on, punished for something maybe you don't even know what it was. You are just doomed to suffer because God's got something against you. There's nothing pleasant in your life, only bitterness. Naomi knows what it's like. Well, no, Naomi really didn't know what it was like. She had no idea what it was really like because the picture she painted for herself was false. The Lord was preparing to do something in her life that would make her famous, fill her with joy. She had given up on the Lord, but the Lord had not given up on her. Exhibit number 1 was standing right beside her. A daughter-in-law named Friend. Ruth was going to bring her a reversal of fortunes. This Moabite woman was going to be an agent of blessing, the way that the God of Israel was going to bless not only Naomi, but the entire nation of Judah, of Israel, and the entire world through her descendants. She thought she was empty, but God would fill her again. I wonder what Ruth felt about this. Can you imagine walking for 3 days with his griping and complaining? Can you imagine Ruth being as helpful and kind as she can, and then to hear Naomi say, I have nothing in my life that's good? And Ruth says, hey, you got me. And Naomi replies, yeah, like I said, I've got nothing. I told you to stay in Moab. It's my pity party, and I'm going to cry if I want to. They don't interrupt me from my focus on self. It's going to take some time, but Naomi will eventually come out of her pity party, and Ruth will help her out. The story has a happy ending. What we have now is a statement of the problem. But be assured of this, that God will provide the solution. And he will do it through this young woman from Moab, the foreigner who takes the oath of allegiance to Naomi, her people, and her God. When we feel empty, we need to look around. Maybe the answer to our problem is nearer than we think. Maybe it's a person. In our state of mind, it might be hard to see that person as part of the solution. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, but there's always someone with you, and that is God, who says, I will never leave you or never forsake you. Now, even though he says that, there may be times when we feel like he has left us empty and afflicted. We might be singing the 22nd Psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me? But we shouldn't stop at verse 1, should we? We need to hear the rest of the psalm. We need to stick with it, and eventually we'll come to hear Psalm 22 and verses 23 and 24. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, honor him. Revere him, all you descendants of Israel, for he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. Jesus knows how we might feel. It was on the cross that he quoted Psalm 22, verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? He voiced that for all of us. Most people have had times when they feel like that. But Jesus knows the rest of the psalm too. He knew that God would bring him out of the valley of the shadow of death. He could go through it and yet fear no evil because he knew that God was with him. So back to Ruth. Ruth 1 and verse 22 summarizes the story up to this point. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem. And then it says, as the barley harvest was beginning, the harvest, there will be food. And Naomi can be filled not just physically, but also emotionally. And that leads us into the next part of the story, which Julian will pick up next week.